And if you know anybody who couldn't come, please share with them the link to the YouTube video so they can watch Niki's talk as well. Okay, so let's just start. I'm just going to tell you how this is going to work. So Niki is going to give her presentation, and then we're going to have some time for questions and answers. You are all muted just to avoid chaos with too many people talking at the same time. So please use the chat to ask any questions. Do ask questions. Niki likes questions. So ask questions, just type them on the chat, and I'm going to ask her at the end. All right, so don't feel shy. It's all in the chat, and don't have to wait until the end of the talk as she speaks. And if you have a question, just type it, and I'm going to write them down and then ask her in the end. That's it for how it's going to work. So this presentation is about the new radar framework that was recently published by the Education Endowment Foundation that Niki created. So she's going to introduce you to that, which is mainly about how to tackle misconceptions and build understanding with your students, which is a really important topic. I want to say that we have a lot of free material to tackle misconceptions on the Seneca website. It's all for free. So we have all the normal chemistry, biology, history courses, and then we have specific ones only to help you tackle misconceptions, the common misconceptions on each of those subjects. So please go on our website and check it out. And that's it. I'm gonna let you 20 seconds for questions. If you have any questions about anything, the webinar itself, just type on the chat. If not, Niki can go ahead and start. No? Oh, good. So Niki, go for it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Flavia. It's really, really nice to be here. I was just going to say, you absolutely don't have to do this at all, but in the weird world that we're living in at the moment, I'm often speaking at a screen. And if you feel comfortable putting your camera on, it does make it feel a little bit less lonely, but I also completely understand if you don't, so don't feel any obligation to. Thank you. That's really nice, Rachel. Thank you. Oh, hello, Robin. Oh, hello, Robin. Okay, so David, it's really nice to see faces. So I'll just work out how to share my screen. Oh, I also need to put my phone on silent, otherwise we're going to have some interruption there. There we are. So thank you to Flavia again. I know Flavia fairly well because she came to Norwich quite a while ago now to talk to us, and she was one of the people that really helped me form my ideas around kind of memory and things like that. So it's really nice to still kind of see her and be here. And also I really, like Seneca, really kind of changed my teaching life quite dramatically in, you know, being able to use things. So it's just, for me, this is a lovely place to be. But I'm here today with a couple of hats on, really. So the talk is called Focusing Your Radar, with 2 A's, on misconceptions. So I will be talking about misconceptions. I'll be talking about why I think they're important, why I think we should take account of them. I am going to be talking about some ways that I think we can take account of them and hopefully show you, and with some examples as well from some teachers. I've just to say, although Flavia said I created this, which, you know, I did, it's my job at the moment to do things like that, which is lovely. I had so much input into this from some absolutely fabulous teachers, and that's why I think it's hit home with people so much, because they've helped me to kind of put it together. So I'm a chemistry teacher. I work at a school in Norwich, but it's also a research school, one of the EEF research schools. So it's the Norwich Research School. But at the moment, I'm seconded 3 days a week to the Education Endowment Foundation as their science content specialist. So this is something that I put together as part of that role. And this picture that I've started off here is one that was suggested to me by a colleague, Katie Waring, who's a science teacher, and she said to me about this picture of Pooh Bear, and how she thinks it's a really good kind of illustration of sometimes some of these misconceptions that can arise. And as a scientist, you kind of look at this. Am I the only one that kind of looks at this? And I love Pooh Bear, by the way. I love A.A. Milne. In fact, I was actually quoting a A.A. Milne poem this morning at school, but so it's something that, but I look at this and there's a little bit of me kind of going, so how is Pooh floating in the air? Because and if he blew into that balloon, I don't think he'd rise up into the sky like this. Just how light is Pooh Bear? And I can't quite shift that scientist bit of me, because we know that for that to happen, we need to heat the air, for example, or it needs to be a gas that's a lot kind of less dense in the air and so on around it. That doesn't mean that I think we should stop telling people stories, by the way. I think that picture is a classic and I love it, and I'm going to keep using that picture. But for me, it's an example of the kind of common misconception that children have, that you blow a balloon up and it gets lighter. And it's not then surprising if people if they don't think of air as a substance, as something that has mass, as this dynamic system, that then it does become harder to understand other things, like, why a mask, why there might even be virus carrying particles that are carried in the air, and why they might travel, and why ventilation might be important. So misconceptions can make it more difficult to understand the world around us in the first place. It's just one example, but it's one of those things that can lead to misunderstandings later. Or another really common misconception for children, or adults probably to a certain extent, is that when you burn something, it disappears. You light a match, it burns, and then it's gone. And so it's a kind of childlike misunderstanding that if we don't work on later on, it makes it more difficult to understand things like conservation of mass. Things are still there. The atoms that were there at the start are still there in a different form at the end. But also things like explosions. Where does that come from? Why does it happen? So all of these things I think are quite important to address quite early on, so that later on we can build and build understanding to the more complex ideas. So, sorry, I'm just suddenly, my screen's gone a bit funny. That's why I was suddenly looking confused. I think it's important to think about where they come from. I mean, this is a picture that I've used before. Apparently, if you're a physicist, this is a really bad picture, so I do apologise if it is. But it's just to make the point that, as someone that's learnt some science, I know that the Earth orbits the sun. But I also know that when I watch the sun rising or setting in the sky, that actually my initial thought that I kind of then put to one side is that it looks like the sun is moving around the Earth. And so you can understand that a lot of these misconceptions arise from all sorts of things, from observing the world around us. There's all sorts of sources of misconceptions, and children have all of these naive ideas before they even step into the classroom with us. So it's really important to take these into account and then build on them. By the way, I'm using the word misconceptions here, and I know that some people are uncomfortable with that, and I understand that. I use it as an umbrella term, really just to make things like this a bit simpler. But I do understand that actually what I'm talking about there is preconceptions. I know that we talk about alternative conceptions, but just as a kind of umbrella term here, I'm talking about misconceptions. And that one with the Earth going around the sun, or the sun going around the Earth, is a really interesting one for me, because that it illustrates quite well this paper that I read a while ago now that's really shaped some of my thinking on this. It's by Andrew Stallman. And the title of the paper basically tells you what the paper says. It's a really interesting paper to look at. But the title of the paper is "Scientific Knowledge Suppresses but Does Not Supplant Earlier Intuitions." And that's, I think, something that we can probably all sympathise with, right? Because it's only because I know I've been told, and there's various evidence that I've been shown that it's the Earth orbiting the sun, that you know, when I check myself, that's my thinking. But my naive idea is probably still the sun is going around the Earth. And Andrew Stallman argues that actually we only ever kind of push those ideas, those naive primal kind of ideas, to one side, and we never actually truly push them out of the way completely, always anyway. And I think as teachers, that's something that I've really kept in mind quite a lot. I mean, we know that children and everybody forgets things, but I think there's also something in reviewing things and going back to them, because it takes a while for some kind of life-changing breakthrough to happen, and I'm not sure it always does. Something else that I think is quite important to consider when I'm thinking about misconceptions and learning and building understanding is how we think about memory in the first place. And I think it's really important that you don't just think of memory as this kind of empty bucket or empty vessel where you just kind of chuck ideas until they kind of sit in there ready for you to pull them out and use again at some point. And that's why really I talk quite a lot when I talk about memory as saying that just because I'm really keen for my students to remember things and even retrieve them, sometimes just memorize them, it's not because I want them just to be able to regurgitate and just to be able to kind of say things like some robotic person. What I'm looking for them to do is to make connections, build on those ideas, use those things that they've memorized to help them make connections with other things, to use the things that have become more fluent to do really interesting creative things in science and so on. And that idea, I think, has to sit at the heart of, I think, teaching in general, but I think certainly at the heart of when we think about misconceptions and how they relate to understanding and building understanding. So if you think of memory as this kind of network of ideas, making connections and so on, the schemas, you know, then another really nice illustration of this, which really is very relevant to misconceptions, is this one from Efrat First. And if by any slim chance you haven't come across Efrat's work before, please do go and visit her website, which is linked to there, because she's a neuroscientist, but she creates these beautiful images that for me explain the neuroscience and the idea about memory and learning and teaching that she's trying to get across. And this one here is a really kind of simple one that just tries to make it clear that as we build knowledge, if we don't have the right kind of foundation, and if we're not making those connections, then really we're just ending up with lots of disconnected ideas, and sometimes they might not even lie there properly if the foundation ideas aren't secure or if they're incorrect. Whereas if we have built, you know, a really solid network of ideas, if we can make those connections between things, if the foundational ideas that we have are correct, then we can begin to build on those ideas until we build, you know, a schema, networks and so on, these interconnected ideas. That to me, and the word that Efrat uses a lot is meaning. That's what makes the meaning from the things that we learn, from the things that we remember. And so if we're building on ideas that are different or wrong, then that's going to affect how we learn from then onwards. And this quote, which I think is from Dylan Williams originally, but it just, for me, this encompasses everything about teaching. And it says, what is taught isn't the same as what is learned. And actually, I have to kind of just sit here and think about this for a minute, even now, and I've said this lots of times, because there's a lot in that. And I think anyone that has ever taught anything knows this, right? We know this because, first of all, we know that we have to assess the children that we teach to know what they've understood. If teaching were as easy as simply, I think Dylan Williams says it in one of his books, that if we could simply just list everything that we've taught, everything that we've said in a lesson, and just say, right, everyone I teach knows that now. We know that's not the case, because there's a certain amount of assimilation and understanding that goes on, but also we know that sometimes we might have taught the most beautiful lesson with the most fabulous questions and the whole class all on, you know, on form and answering all their questions correctly. I've never had a lesson like this, by the way, but just assume that you've had one of these amazing lessons, and then suddenly you take in an assessment, or you take in their books, or you see how they've answered a question, and you kind of look through and you think, how on earth did they understand that from what I said? Or how did they not understand? Or oh gosh, they haven't understood this, or, you know, whatever the million things we think whenever we kind of mark a book or a test. But the point is that people understand things in different ways. And partly it's to do with this. It's to do with what you're building on in the first place. And that's why this is an example I've used before. This for me kind of sums it up. That I remember being told when I was a child that this is the Plow. This is a constellation that people call the Plow. And I remember looking at it thinking, the Plow? Why is that called the Plow? That's evident. That's very obviously a saucepan. I have no idea what this has to do with a plough. I'd never seen a plough, not one that looks like that, not one that's kind of horse drawn. I don't actually know if I'd ever seen one anyway. I was growing up in a seaside town and it wasn't particularly agricultural, so I couldn't make that connection without that foundational knowledge to build those things on. I couldn't work out how the plough came into it. By the way, sorry if there's a bit of screaming in the background. I've got 4 children here today. That's the life of the pandemic times. But so what we learn what we teach doesn't necessarily translate directly to what people learn. And we have to take into account people's prior understanding, people's prior ideas, yes, their preconceptions, yes, their misconceptions, yes, the things that they understand. And it doesn't necessarily mean kind of wiping it out necessarily, but it means building on it. It means uncovering it and finding out what's there, and then building on those ideas. So just to reiterate then, I think it's really important that we don't think of our memory as this bucket. We're not just chucking things in there. Sometimes it's about assimilating, so making space for new ideas and finding the way that they connect to other things, and that's how we make meaning from things. But you know, sometimes actually it can also mean forgetting things that we formerly understood. If we always thought that the earth was flat, and I think to a certain extent everybody starts off thinking they would never think of the earth as what is it, a sphere? No, it's probably not. They wouldn't think of it as anything other than flat, because their experience of the world around them is this flat earth. But at one point, most people, not all, you can talk to the flat earthers and they might dispute this, but most people accept that the earth isn't flat. And then they have to let go of those ideas that they had before. So learning isn't just about adding new things in. It's not just about stuffing new ideas in or even just assimilating them. Sometimes you have to let go of ideas as well. And I think that can be quite tough sometimes. And that can be something that is quite difficult for the students that we teach to do sometimes. If you've got quite a strong belief and something that's really helped you to get through, and suddenly you're being told to let go of that can be quite a scary thing to do. I used to talk a lot about, and I still think a lot about, this concept called threshold concepts, and I think they're a really useful idea. And one of the things that they talk about in when they're talking about threshold concepts and mastery of concepts and ideas is that sometimes that process of letting go is quite liminal. You take steps forward, but you take steps back. And they talk about an analogy with adolescence, when you're kind of a little bit childlike, but you're going into being an adult, but you're kind of stuck in between, or bereavement, where you take a step forward, but then you have you take a step back. It happened to me a few years ago, and you think you're over it. And it's the same with learning sometimes. You've got a way of getting to the right answer, and then your teacher comes along and tells you that actually you've got to leave that behind. That's not an easy thing to do all the time. So sometimes learning involves forgetting and letting go of beliefs rather than just kind of cramming more stuff in. So with all of those things in mind, I had some work to do with the EEF, which is really lovely. I wanted to raise awareness, first of all, about misconceptions. Actually, in teachers, me certainly, I don't know, I will talk for myself. I certainly held a few, and I think it's really important to kind of understand and address those ourselves and admit to them and feel comfortable about doing that, but also certainly in the children that we teach. And I also wanted to kind of come up with some practical ways to help us plan around them and take them into account. So that's where these infographics came from. And I was just so lucky that Andy Brunning, who is responsible for these compound interest graphics that you will have seen because they're amazing, worked with me on them and made them look so beautiful. And I started here, really. This is when we were planning the science training for the EEF a few years ago, a group of us, there's a video of Harvard graduates coming out of, I think it's a ceremony for their PhDs. And they question these Harvard graduates about this particular question: where does the bulk of a tree come from? And actually, most of them said the soil or the water. And it isn't, it's the air, because it comes from, the carbon in the carbon dioxide in the air that's used in photosynthesis and so on. But it's a good example of where graduates from Harvard, in a scientific discipline, still had these kind of misconceptions. Now, we could quibble about whether it's a misconception or whether they just haven't thought it through, but it was my starting point of the graphic. But also I wanted to kind of get across some of these ideas that lots of people think, really, and how important it is to take it into account. And actually, when I was putting this together, I drew heavily on a book. Actually, it's here. Called Misconceptions in Primary Science by Michael Allen. I don't know if you can see it there, no, because I've got this weird screen on. And honestly, I flicked through this book, and some of the time I was thinking, oh yes, I think I understood that. We do have to check our own understanding as well sometimes, and I think it's really worth doing that. Then this infographic here. This started off from these diagrams up here. I think I've asked in a few polls, I've asked people, what colour deoxygenated blood is, and actually a fair proportion of them will say blue, because we do have these diagrams where hearts are coloured in red and blue, and if we look at our veins and they're blue, there's lots of reasons that we might kind of hold that misconception, but it is one that is quite common. So really the idea of this was just to kind of get people talking about it, the kind of misconceptions they have, but also where these misconceptions might come from in the first place. So for example, I did very much so in my early days of teaching talk about atoms wanting a full outer shell. It terrifies me that I've got lots of PowerPoints out there that people have borrowed from me that still say things like that on them. And to a certain extent, I'd kind of defend the right to do that, because I think on some level, sometimes it's helpful to kind of pretend to be a particle, or, for me, that I'm quite comfortable with doing that kind of thing in lessons. But I do recognise that if you do things like that, you have to be very careful about how you do it, because chemistry actually ultimately is all about random processes. There are no atoms that want to do anything. It's random processes that are driven by various kind of energetics and so on. And actually it can really you know, really harm or can hinder understanding later if your ideas are all around kind of atoms, searching out other atoms and wanting to swap electrons with them and so on. So these kind of misconceptions and alternative conceptions do come from a range of sources. And I think one of the things that I'm really keen that we kind of help each other to do is think about these before we even get to the classroom. What's the kind of language that I might use if I'm not careful that might actually add to confusion? What do I need to draw people's attention to in this textbook? Because it's a really good diagram, but maybe they'll then think that deoxygenated blood is blue or whatever it is. And so it's not about you know, saying anything is bad or good. It's about saying, okay, if we're going to do this, what do I need to take into account and what do I, you know, need to consider beforehand? The other thing that I think is really good to think about is, you know, how you teach, how you deal with these misconceptions, how you tackle them. The EEF Science Guidance Report talks about building on the ideas that children bring to lessons. And you can do that in a range of ways. But I do think it's worth kind of asking the question, well, is it enough to just tell people? I mean, is it enough to just say, well, deoxygenated blood isn't red, it isn't blue, it's kind of a very dark red, and then job done, and we don't have to think about it anymore? And I think to a certain extent, you know, there is an argument for that, you know, there are some things that you can just tell people. My worry about things like that is going back to that Stallman paper and the idea of kind of suppressing ideas and also thinking about my own experience. Actually, I wrote a blog recently where I embarrassingly admitted to a really awful misconception. If you're a biology teacher and you haven't read this, I'm not going to give away what my awful misconception was, but you can have a look and you will be your head in your hands, because it's a really classic thing to come out with. And I came out with this biology misconception around photosynthesis and respiration at the start of a postdoc. You know, I'd done my biology GCSE years ago, and so at one point I kind of understood this, but at one point I'd then forgotten it, or I'd misunderstood, or something had happened. These ideas, I think, need to be reinforced, and sometimes I think telling people isn't enough, and sometimes we do need to confront those beliefs. You know, sometimes we can blow up a balloon and compare the mass before and afterwards if you've got a sensitive enough balance, or, you know, whatever it is, or tie it to a teddy bear and see if it does float up in the air. Maybe it doesn't, and maybe we need to rethink our thinking around things. You know, so I think really it isn't straightforward, but we do have to take into account what I was saying before about that process of learning. Learning would be easy if we just simply told people things, they remembered things, they understood it, we asked them some questions, we moved on, job done. In my experience, certainly that isn't the case. Learning looks a little bit more like this. It's a liminal process. Not only is it a liminal process where sometimes you take steps backwards as well as forwards, and you have to revisit things and you have to check your understanding. The other thing that I am quite conscious of is that sometimes it's quite easy, not relatively easy, to find a way to the correct answer without actually understanding how you got there. And, you know, sometimes you see that with your, you know, the pupils that are retaining best in science will be the most reluctant to go back and revisit and check that they understand it. And often they get by, and often they'll be fine, because they're often the ones that are used to doing well, and they'll find ways around it. But there will be one point where they become unstuck. And so, you know, there's a balance here. And so another aspect of this that I think we need to think about when we're thinking about misconceptions is just that, really. How do we understand if children we teach really do understand in the way that we think they do? And this question here, I've put this up because it's one that I used in a a research project that I did with some support from the Royal Society of Chemistry, and it was looking at misconceptions and how common they are. I started off thinking about looking at how common they were in children, in students, but somebody just suggested that I look at teachers' misunderstanding or misconceptions as well. And this was one of the questions that I asked. And if you just want to read it through and check what you think the answer is. And I would tell you that a substantial proportion of science teachers said that that's true. And that's understandable, right? Because they have a similar misconception there to a lot of the children that we teach. And I started to uncover that misconception a while ago in a year 11 lesson with some students, where a certain conversation about ionic lattices made me understand that the pupil that I was talking to, although she was getting the right answer and everything, was misunderstanding the point that ions have this kind of, don't just have a charge that's located in the top right hand corner and they're attracted in all directions. And again, that's a really common misconception, but again, it's one that a lot of science teachers have as well. So I think there's something in checking our own understanding and not being afraid to do that, because honestly, if I think back to the beginning of my PGCE, and bearing in mind that I was coming into my chemistry PGCE after doing a chemistry PhD and a postdoc afterwards, you know, research chemistry, but I remember sitting in some of my PGCE sessions and just thinking, did I know that? I mean, even things like why lithium was less reactive than potassium, I remember kind of thinking, do I know that? And there's nothing wrong with doing that, I don't think. But also from the point of view of the children that we teach and how we teach them, I think this is really important to take into account. So something I've talked about quite a lot is that this then led me to change the way that I was teaching ionic bonding, because I would really think carefully about the language, bonds versus attraction. I would think about really making sure that the students I taught didn't think about that charge as being localized. I would think about making sure that they didn't think that there was a sodium and a chloride ion that had been atoms once that swapped electrons and they were forever bound together and never to be, you know, attracted to any other ion. There were all these kind of ideas that I'd not really thought about before, and then changed how I taught, and also was very careful about the way that I assessed and uncovered understanding in my pupils. And this diagram here, another one from Ifrat First, this then for me draws together all of that, because you're a teacher. If you're a teacher, you are an expert in your subject. You have already reached this level here. So to be a teacher, you will have started off as a novice. You will have started to make connections, those connections that we were talking about earlier on between different ideas. You will have built your understanding until you've built your expertise here. But as well as being an expert, you are also a teacher. And as a teacher, what you do that's different to other experts is you are able to view these ideas that the novice is seeing for the first time in the way that they see them. And you are able to think about the ways that you can help that novice to build those connections, that student really. You know, you are able to think about the wrong answers as well as the right answers. I know that I'm doing my students a disservice if ever I am walking into a lesson kind of looking in the textbook going, oh gosh, I've got to work out what I'm learning today. We don't want to do that. We know that that's not a good thing to do, because it's not good enough just to know the stuff that we're going to teach. As teachers, what we do is we look at things from with hindsight as well as foresight. We're able to see where it's leading to. We're able to make those links that our students can't link. We know what they did last year and how that links to what we're doing today. We know what they're doing next year and how that links to what we're doing today. We know what it feels like not to understand what you're teaching today, and you know how to help them to understand that. That's an area that I'm really interested in called pedagogical content knowledge, and that pedagogical content knowledge is what makes you a teacher. An expert has subject knowledge, you have pedagogical content knowledge, you know how to get that across to your students. And so that's for me the important thing about misconceptions. It's not just knowing that they exist, it's not just knowing that they're important, it's not just knowing why they're important, it's not just thinking it's really important to take account of those, it's knowing how to take account of them and what to do once you know that. And so that's where the thinking behind this radar framework, that kind of builds into this. And so what I wanted to do here was find a way of kind of focusing, framing that thinking that we do as teachers before we teach. So before we even get into the lesson, there will be some kind of thinking that we do around the likely kind of ideas, misconceptions, preconceptions, understanding, misunderstanding that the children will bring to the lessons that we're just about to teach. So then when we're with them, we begin to uncover those, that's the teaching bit. But then for me, the really important bit of this is that we then link this to future learning, we go back. And actually this box here, as a teacher, I think that's a really key box. If there's a way, I mean, whether you do it on this bit of paper or not, another thing that we do is think, oh, I've got to remember to come back and look at those words later because I didn't quite get that, you know. And then, so this really is meant to be cyclical. You know, this isn't a one-off process. These are ideas that we build on as we go through. And just to kind of take it apart a little bit. So, you know, this research and anticipate, this is from the, you know, when I was talking about the network of ideas and the links that you want to make, that's, you know, really that's where this bit comes in. We've got to think before we even get to the lesson, what are those things that you have to understand before you've even started to kind of understand the new topic that you're moving to? What are those most common misconceptions that they bring? How are you going to find those out? You know, and actually I'm going to introduce someone called Emma Taylor in a minute, who's just recorded a video for us about this. And she said, you know, she does things like looking in examiner reports and talking to other people about it. And even just thinking back to the last time you taught it is a really good thing to do. Sorry, I'm just going to tell my children to be quiet. Whoops. Sorry. And then there's something here about the language and vocabulary here. You know, what are those key terms that if you're not careful, you're going to use that actually could reinforce some of those understandings? What are those words that have kind of dual meaning that if you're not careful, they'll be thinking about it in a different context and not in this context? What do you have to be really careful of, and where can you find out about those before you even get to the lesson? I was going to say a really good source of some of this, if you're a chemist, is the Royal Society of Chemistry. Their Education in Chemistry website has so much of this stuff on. I know the IOP is fabulous for this with physics. I'm not so up to date with biology, but also the ASE as well has the best evidence in science teaching resources. So there is so much out there, and they're really, really good resources. But what for me, the key point is that you take all of these and you think about them before you even get there. And also, when we're thinking about memory, in this context, it's those links that you make to previous topics. And I'll show you an example in a minute from a teacher called Helen Slipper about how she's really thought carefully about this, not just what you're doing today, but what they did last week, what they did at their previous school. You know, it's all plays into where you are today. And then so the next section is more around really the bread and butter of teaching. You know, how are you going to uncover those ideas that they already hold? How are you going to diagnose their understanding? What are those questions that you're going to use? What are those plausible answers that you might bring in? What are those prompts that you can use, like concept cartoons? How can you stimulate discussion? If you're someone that's good at doing really good kind of discussion in lessons, that's a fabulous time to uncover and understand what what pupils think. the reason that I started talking about ions so obsessively was after one conversation in a lesson with one of the children that I taught for 2 years. You know, sometimes they really surprise you, and it has to be kind of unstructured and open, I think, to do that. And then, you know, think about those activities that you might use in a lesson to do that. And again, there's so many resources. We are not starved of resources in science. We have a really rich bank of resources out there to use, but it's thinking about that before you get there. But key for me, really, I think, is this bit here, because I think one of the main things that I've learned as a teacher is that if only we could teach something and assume that it was there forever. Not only was it there forever, but it was always understood in the same way forever. And I think making sure that we assess and review and come back and check understanding, and before we go on to future topics where there are explicit links, you know, really obvious links between topics, make sure that we reactivate that understanding before we get there. Check that understanding, even if it's in a homework beforehand or a quiz or whatever. Again, when we're thinking about that pedagogical content knowledge, what we know as teachers is what those links are. And sometimes those links aren't very clear if you're encountering things for the first time. And sometimes those things aren't very clear because they're on, you know, a level that we can't even see, submicroscopic level in chemistry, atoms, ions, and so on. So that's a chance to really kind of think through those ideas and how they might fit together. And I thought I'd finish off with a bit of exemplification of some of this, because, as I said, I really had so much input into this from some brilliant teachers, and thank you. And so these are just some ideas, and I hope they don't mind. I've taken their Twitter profile pics because I thought, well, they're out there anyway in public, so there are some big photos of people. So this is a picture of Michael Denican, who is a teacher in London, and he wrote a brilliant blog for the EEF about language and misconceptions, and how to take care of them. And actually, the reason I knew he might want to do that in the first place is because we did a session for Cog Sci over the summer where we were just talking about structure and bonding in general, and we were talking about misconceptions, and in that he talked about language. What I'll do is I'll put a link up at the end where you can see Michael's blog and the structure and bonding discussion and stuff like that if you want to. So, you know, language, that's a really good place to look. So I think it's really good to think about the words that have a dual meaning, or language that can trigger or enhance misconceptions. They all relate to how and what pupils will learn. And this is Holly Walsh, and she knows I refer to her as the misconceptions queen, so I hope she won't mind me doing that here. Holly is a teacher at Melscott, and again, she has written about how the department really work together to support each other. And I think one of the things that we're really missing at the moment, in times as they are, is that chance to just kind of sit in the coffee room and talk about this stuff informally. They really did have a really good structure going of kind of talking these things through, having joint planning meetings to check, and especially when you're teaching out of subject. She wrote a really good blog about how they support teachers that are teaching out of their own specialism. So again, it's really worth kind of reading that to see how they embed it. And they have dash it lessons, I love it, where they kind of help students to kind of look through the things that they got wrong and talk about why it is. It's a really nice one. But again, this is all about the kind of thinking about it beforehand, supporting people, and then also making those links afterwards. Lauren Stevenson, she's a physics teacher in Blackpool. And what she did is she took the best evidence science teaching resources, and she's written about how she actually embedded that within their schemes of work, within their system, and so on. She's very good at kind of making these systematic so that they're used by everybody within the department. So there's another blog there that I'll link to at the end. And this is Tandy Banda, who is a teacher in, I think she's in London. I've never met her. She's one of these people that I've only spoken to, but I'm pretty sure she's in London. Sorry, Tandy. But she's been using the radar framework to help her PGCE student plan lessons and actually to think through how that thinking that often is quite implicit in what we do as experienced science teachers. We'll be thinking about this stuff before we walk out into the lesson. We'll be ready to kind of uncover those lessons, those misconceptions, and respond to them in the lesson. When you're working with other people, sometimes it's really good to have those prompts and those questions to think about before you get there. So it's been really interesting hearing about what she's doing. So I think it's worth thinking about how you can embed this into your departmental practice and your joint planning, but also I think how it might not be for you, but how it could help to support other people that don't have that kind of thinking that you do more unconsciously. And this is Emma Taylor, who I spoke about earlier. She has just recorded a really lovely video for us that we're going to release next week or the week after, talking about how she takes these misconceptions into account. And it was really good to kind of hear about where she finds the ideas from and how much it's part of her practice. So it's just to kind of say, have a look out for those. This is Helen Slipper, who's a science teacher in Bottisham, I think is the name of the town. It'll come up on the next slide. Sorry, Helen. Helen actually really helped shape my thinking in this from a conversation we had back in January about thinking about, you know, Key Stage 2 into Key Stage 3. I think sometimes we're a little bit too much. All right, I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I am too much in a Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 bubble, and I don't think enough about Key Stage 2 and how we got here. And actually doing this work, I've really had to kind of look at some of those primary science ideas and link to them. And she does a lot of this, and it's really worth, I'm hoping she'll write a bit more about it soon. But what she's done in the meantime, she's actually put together, Bottisham Village College. She's actually filled in one of these radar frameworks for particles. And I think what it's really interesting to see that she, again, this section here where she's linked back to Key Stage 2 and all those terms that they have learned, we forget that they've learned things, but it's also about checking that understanding of what they've learned before they meet us. And then some of the activities, I just love this, so I just thought I'd highlight this, some of the activities she's using to kind of uncover things. But this I thought was really worth showing you, because she's not just thinking about her next chemistry topic. Again, you know, when we're thinking about bubbles, oh God, bubbles is not a word I should be using right now. Bubbles are everywhere. Anyway, if we're thinking about our little kind of frame of consciousness, I guess, we often forget that there are other subjects as well. And that's where I think sitting down and talking about this with other colleagues who perhaps have other specialisms and thinking about how these ideas translate is really, really important. So what I hope that we can do is also think about how we can embed this kind of thinking, not just within, you know, lesson planning, my own planning, but also joint planning within a department and sharing ideas with others, and how we can use those prompts to kind of see what other people think about what we're going to teach. The only other thing I was going to say is I've shown you some really lovely typed up versions, but this is one I was using, and I just printed it out and scrawled all over it. It's a prompt for thinking. It's not a formal document in my head. It's something that we use to kind of, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's something just to prompt that thinking before we go in, or to make our implicit unconscious thinking explicit for someone else who perhaps hasn't got as much experience for it as us. It doesn't have to be this perfect thing. And we also don't have to answer that. There's some prompts in the framework that people use, and you don't have to answer every single one of those prompts. It's not a tick box exercise. What I'd be really afraid of is if this morphs into something that people start going, well, have you considered this? And I see that you haven't done this prompt point there. That is not what this is for. This is just when you're thinking about things, is there something here that you could think about as you plan the lesson? I ought to point out actually that so there is a version that's got some prompts for thinking on it, but there is now an editable version of it as well. If you go to, so a blank version, if you go to the tools, which is around the science guidance report, I think I linked to it on Twitter recently, but I'll also put it on the page that I'll link to at the end of this. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of a flavour of what I hope you might use it for, and why I produced it in the first place. I have to say thank you so much, because honestly, I've had so much input from people that help me plan and refine, change, develop, improve it along the way. And I haven't listed them here because I would just offend someone by leaving them off, and there's too many, and thank you. But special thanks to Efrat first. But I mean, not just for being inspirational and helping me to understand things, but also allowing me to use those images. Katie Waring for the poo idea, and also the people whose exemplification I've used today in my talk. Thank you very much. Whew. Oh, and what I was going to say is I haven't set this up yet, but I will set up a web page and give it the bit.ly link there, so that if you want to look at any links for anything, then I'll put it there. Thank you. I'll stop now.
Great. Thank you so much, Niki. That was great. That was really, really great. Yeah, if you can then, after the link is ready and things are up there, just let me know, or just tweet, and then we retweet, and then we can send to people by email as well, people that came to the webinar. So a few questions. So a couple of practical questions. So Victoria wants to know if she can find those infographics on the EEF website, the ones you showed at the beginning. And then Leona wants you to recommend a few books that talk about misconceptions and how to tackle them. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I just muted myself for some reason. And now I've forgotten what the second question was. The infographics, books. Yes, but yes. Any books to recommend? Yes, right. Any infographics? Yes, the infographics are on the EEF website. If you go to the web page that has the Improving Secondary Science Guidance report on, then there's a link there to, it says associated tools or something like that, and underneath where it says associated tools, there's the infographics, there's also the radar template, but there's also the editable one as well. And if that doesn't work, if you look down my Twitter timeline, I'm sure I've retweeted it. I recently wrote a blog for the EEF, and that's got links to it in as well, or otherwise just ask me if you can't find it, and I will I'll send it to you. But yes, it's on the EEF website on the Science Guidance Report page. As for books, so as a chemist, honestly, we are just spoilt because Keith Tabor has written just so many amazing things for chemists. So anything by Keith Tabor, and a lot of that is free to access if you look at the Education in Chemistry website on the Royal Society of Chemistry. And he not only kind of has books about misconceptions, but my starting point for ionic bonds was there are lots of kind of true false quizzes as well. So Education in Chemistry, if you're a chemist, physics, so you know, the learner societies, the IOP and the ASC and so on, a really good source. The book, honestly, I'm not joking, the book that has helped me the most recently, I'll just get rid of my stupid background, it's only because I've got messy shelves. There we go. This book here, I honestly, it's a godsend. I think for any secondary teacher, you'll still find stuff in this. It's Misconceptions in Primary Science by Michael Allen. My colleague Kirsten Mould, who's the content specialist for learning behaviours at the EEF, she pointed me to it, and I've just loved it ever since. Also things like, you know, the classics by Rosalind Driver and so on, and also Vanessa Kind, I never know how to pronounce her name, has written lots of really good stuff around science misconceptions. A lot of it's kind of free to access, so it's really worth having a look.
Yeah, good, great. There was a comment here from David saying that about the futility of judging teachers' effectiveness on students' grades, which are the cumulative outcome of 16 years of experiences. And then somebody else asked if all of thinking about misconceptions should have any implications on how GCSE and A-level exams are built.
Oh
I think
gosh.
they go
Well,
together.
so I do agree. I do agree, by the way, that
Yeah.
when we have students in years, for example, years 10 and 11, they are the product of their entire schooling system, and we can't get away from that. And so I can't comment beyond that, other than say, yes, I agree with you. I am not an expert in assessment, and I would not like to, sorry, there are people that have much stronger opinions than me on this. I'm afraid I'm a pragmatist. So I have, quite often I take on a year 11 group. I've taken on a year 13 group before in year 13. So as a teacher, I just deal with the situation I have and the understanding that I have and go from there. And sometimes you're uncovering and catching up and doing all sorts of things as you teach. But yeah, that's teaching. And yes, accountability. Yes, I agree. But yes, that's the situation we're in at the moment.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so something less tough. For parents, so some parents, they just don't know, obviously, as much content on sciences, so they might teach their kids something that is wrong. So how do we address that?
But it can come from anywhere. Yes, parents. Yes, the world around them. Yes, science teachers. Yes, me. I'm sure sometimes a biologist, if they walked into some of my lessons, would hang their heads and pull their hair out of some of the things I say. It is just a constant, I was going to say battle, but it's not a battle. It's a constant challenge to just, or maybe the constant joy of teaching, that you think that people think one thing and you find out they think the complete opposite. For me, that is the importance of constantly reviewing, revisiting, and never assuming that it's a job done just because they've done something before. I think that's the main lesson that I've learned as a teacher, that you just don't make any assumptions. You talk to children and you find out what they know and you go from there, whatever the situation. Because even if they haven't had that at home, and I do agree that's a problem, there's all sorts of things that lead to that kind of thing. Even if they haven't had that, there might be something else that means they haven't quite understood it in the right way. So yeah.
And then you talked a lot about, well, a bit about primary and then secondary. So there were a few questions about what would be the main difference, or how can we tell between misconceptions and just using simpler models in primary to explain things to kids.
Yeah, models are an interesting one, aren't they? Yeah, I think that's different to misconceptions. I think what you have to be aware of, so I think models are fabulous, but as with everything, they have to be used carefully, and I just think you have to be careful to. I think what's really important to understand in science is that science is a model. It's a series of models, right? And at the moment, we're teaching the best fit models that we have on the evidence that we have. And that might change, and it has changed. And so, it's okay for these models to evolve. It's okay to kind of say, this is a good enough model for now. It's okay to say, well, I know we talked about this at primary school, or I know we talked about this last year, but actually now we're going to delve a bit deeper. And it's okay to use models, but it's also important to help children to understand that they're not a perfect model. And I think, that we talk about this quite a lot in kind of cog science, that it's always better to use more than one models, because then you don't focus on the one model that you're giving, and maybe the one model you've chosen isn't one that they understand, and so on. So I think, as with everything, a model can lead to certain misconceptions if you don't use them cautiously. For me, the important thing is not to say that was wrong. It's just, now we're going to build on this a bit more, and we're going to delve a bit deeper, or we're going to broaden it, or whatever. That's the kind of language I think is important.
Yeah. Great. So I think we have time for one more. So speaking of language, you talked about the chemistry language at one point, and then Leona asked if you can just talk a bit more about that.
Oh, you mean the kind of language, dual meanings and so on? Oh gosh, off the top of my head. Yeah. I'll try. Well, things like, sometimes it's not even a dual meaning. I think sometimes so indicator is the one that took me surprise when I started teaching, because I thought it was really obvious what it meant, but actually it isn't always. And so sometimes it's good to kind of take examples from real life. The classic one is things like cell. Cell has millions of meanings in science. I'm not doing, I can't think of any. I should have had some in my head, but that's the point really. I think you think about a topic and you go through and you kind of think, where might they have come across these words before? What might they think this word means? And to do it kind of topic by topic, that kind of sounds like I'm escaping the question.
You just said tissue on the chat. Yeah, so Mrs. Williams just said tissue as an example.
Tissue. Oh yeah, tissue is another one. Yeah. Material. When you first start teaching about materials and they think it's material, and actually, it has a wider meaning. And so it's things like that, I think, that have a specific scientific meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Okay, so it's after 5 now, so unfortunately we have to stop. Thank you so much, Niki. That was really, really great. If anybody still has questions, please go on Twitter, and I'm sure Niki will be happy to answer and talk to you and carry on with the conversation. Do visit senecalearning.com for our misconception courses, and visit the EEF website for Niki's work on the radar framework as well. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great day or evening already. See you next time.